Hello, coaches. We are listening actively with this recording. Let's dive into Competency 6 and dig into the elements and how it compares between the ACC, PCC, and MCC expectations. So, without further ado, let's jump in. Okay. So, listens actively. Definition focuses on what the client is and is not saying. Not just like intuitively what they're not saying, but also like primarily we're looking at what the client is communicating through their body language, their tone, and the language, like kind of tracking patterns of what they're like the keywords that they're using or not using throughout the session. To fully understand what is being communicated in the context of the client systems to support the client's self-expression. And keep in mind, this understand is, like we've said before, not an understanding for our own diagnostic purposes, but really to support the client's self-expression and their understanding in relation to their agreement or their agenda for the session. So, all right, let's dive into the elements here. Number one, considers the client's context, identity, environment, experiences, values, and beliefs to enhance understanding of what the client is communicating. So we are listening holistically, and as we are listening to them, we ideally are hearing echoes of what they've shared before, what we know about their story, what they said at the top of the session, what they said a couple of paragraphs before. We're kind of combining our listening so that we're not just hearing the thing they just said, but we're hearing across the session. You can really see this in assessing, where a coach that is getting used to using a bit of client language tend to use language from the last two sentences, whereas an MCC coach uses language across an entire engagement. Can be very, very powerful to be able to do that. Number two, reflects or summarizes what the client communicated to ensure clarity and understanding. And this has been clarified in different places where the summary is not for the coach's benefit, but for the client's benefit. If a coach does paraphrasing, summarizing, or reflecting of the language, it shouldn't be done to just confirm that the coach heard them. It should be done to help the client hear themselves. Very rarely should the coach use summary to say, okay, did I hear you right? Here's what I heard. Because the focus of the coaching engagement shouldn't be on the coach completely understanding and grasping what the client has said, because like we've seen in other spots, a coach should be able to be comfortable coaching without really knowing all the details. So this element is primarily focused on helping the client's understanding through summary and reflection. Recognizing and inquiring when there is more to what the client is communicating. So as you hear a person say, yeah, I think that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. What's that saying? They're communicating that they're going ahead and doing the thing, but their voice is communicating hesitancy, or at least it seems like it is. So for the coach to say, oh, your tone really got quiet there as you said that you're going to do that. What are you feeling as you say that out loud? So we help the person recognize when there might be more to what they're communicating, but we don't demand it either. We don't like label it and say, you really don't want to do this. Why is that? Like, we don't take our stance as reality or our interpretation as reality, but we listen to our intuition and interpretation and offer those as part of observations, or just use that intuition to help guide what we ask questions about. Notices and acknowledges and explores the client's emotions, energy shifts, and nonverbal cues or other behaviors. This is kind of what we're just saying, and the different elements that you might use as part of interpretive or fact-based observations. I cover those in other places. The main thing with using observations is to hand it back openly to the client. So whatever we share, whether it's reflecting back something that they literally did or reflecting back our interpretation of what emotion they're demonstrating, we always want to just openly hand it back and saying, instead of saying like, oh, why are you feeling that way that I just labeled for you? Instead, I might say, I get the sense that you might be a little bit afraid of taking that path, but what do you feel? Or what's your interpretation? So whatever we say, if we offer an interpretive observation or fact-based observation, it's just important to allow the client to respond. So to do that kind of work, it takes noticing. And that's where, that's under the listens actively category. How you How you measure it, that's kind of this mixture between the evokes awareness and um, um, maintaining presence. Like you see this being done and how responsive the coach is in using the client's language and behavior in the open exploration of the session. Integrates the client's words, tone of voice, and body language to determine the full meaning of what is being communicated. Again, it's not up to the coach to diagnose for them to fully understand what's being communicated, but to integrate all of these things in a package of a question so that the client can synthesize their perspective. They can bring their thoughts together and they can better understand the full meaning of what is being communicated. So just keep wanting to make it clear that the ICF isn't communicating that the coach needs to be the one who is determining the reality of the client, interpreting it, and making sure that they have that interpretation correct. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if the coach is correct with the interpretation. It doesn't really matter if the coach fully understands what the client is talking about. It matters that the client understands what they're talking about and learns from what they're sharing. So a few extra thoughts there. Notices trends in the client's behavior, emotions across session to discern themes and patterns. And this is where you go from reflecting language in the immediate to reflecting language and body language and shifts all across a session or even between sessions. Key skills evaluated. The coach's depth of attention to what the client communicates in relation to the client and the client's agenda. So this is essentially using client language and body language as part of the agenda setting. Number 2, the coach's ability to hear on multiple levels, including both the emotional and substantive content of the words. This goes back to responsiveness and maintaining presence and evoking awareness, what we'll see next with Competency 7. We want to bring the multiple levels of listening into the way we respond with open questions and reflections. The coach's ability to hear underlying beliefs, thinking, creating, and learning that are occurring for the client, including recognizing incongruities in language, emotions, and actions. And it's not for the coach to say, oh, you contradicted yourself. Oh, look at that contradiction. Why is that contradiction there? It's more, I think I'm hearing a different thing than what they've said before. Let me highlight it. What are your thoughts on what I just said there, client? So we're listening not just to what the words are, but how those words relate to other things that are said. As you think about the arc of a coaching session, if the agenda is set, the client is going to articulate what kind of the theme of the session is. And then they'll use certain words to articulate that theme. And they will, they'll rehash that theme quite a few times throughout the session with new words. It sounds complicated as I say it out loud. But really, with every paragraph, every exchange between coach and client, there's oftentimes a medium share. It's 2 or 4 main ideas that are expressed multiple ways as the client is thinking about the thing, and they rename and relabel things as they say it out loud. And so as you hear maybe that major theme being adjusted and reflected on in different ways throughout the session, 20 minutes later after the original agenda setting, the way the person is talking about that earlier theme will have evolved. It's going to have evolved by 20 minutes into the session. And so as a coach is listening, if you just listen to the immediate expression and follow the immediate expression of the client, then you're missing a great opportunity to help the client think about the arc, the story so far. So this is another reason why it's so important to set an agenda, is to help set that flag in the journey so that the client can reflect on where they've come and how the way they're talking about things now might be related to the way they brought that topic in at the beginning of the session. So we listen holistically across a session, and we listen for connections, incongruities, things that might be worth putting side by side. At the beginning, you had this smile on your face when you said, this is going to happen. This is going to be the news that is going to be shared between the manager and the team. And right now, you've gotten really quiet as you talk about what that news is. What's shifted for you between the beginning and now? So something like that is how you might highlight an incongruity across a session and allow the client with that open question, what are your thoughts on what shifted for you? That allows the client to synthesize, to connect the dots. And oftentimes that type of work, when doing it in a safe way, not, that's a contradiction. When you're doing it in a safe way, it really can be some of the most effective portions of a coaching session. All right. Coach's ability to hear and integrate the client's language and to invite the client to deeper exploration. And this is really important from that perspective of the, make sure I don't lose that. Let's see, what slide is this? With the idea of the range, the coach's ability to help the clients across the range of transactional ACC minimums to transformational MCC minimums, that kind of work is very important, and our ability to offer deeper exploration, even to those who are coming in fresh. They kind of want more transactional coaching. They're coming in kind of with just a problem to be solved. They don't really know much about coaching. And the ability to hear and integrate the client's language into the exploration is the best way to do deeper exploration. A client that's come in and they say, can you help me with my LinkedIn profile? Like I really need to improve it because I'm hoping to do some job applications. And if the coach just goes in and says, like, what values do you feel are really important to honor as part of your, redesign of your LinkedIn profile? I mean, that's not a bad question. Not a bad question, but it's just it's not responsive. It doesn't feel like it matches that client's energy. Now, if we replay that moment and I were to say, when you're talking about redesigning your LinkedIn profile, you kind of had this grimace. I don't know. I would label it maybe as a grimace. How do you feel about the redesign of LinkedIn? How do you feel about LinkedIn in light of the grimace is going to be a values-oriented and emotion-oriented question, but it doesn't feel as forced. It doesn't sound like, how are you feeling today when it comes to LinkedIn? It's responsive. It is using that client language in order to invite the deeper exploration. If we use the client language, it is the best way to coach around the who, especially if we're using more meaningful pieces of client language. Sometimes I get pushback from coaches that they don't feel natural or comfortable asking questions about being, purpose, emotion, fears, hopes, dreams, values. And it's because they're asking questions that use words like purpose, values, dreams, emotion, or feeling. And those aren't necessarily bad words, but if you can bring in the client language, that language from the client, when the client says, yeah, it's going to be, I always say shipwreck and train wreck. I'm sorry. I don't know why. It's just going to be disaster. We'll just say it's going to be a major disaster on Friday. To be able to say, oh, well, what's wrong with a bit of a disaster on this Friday? And that's going to explore a lot of stuff in relation to values, sense of purpose, emotional state, way a person sees themselves, just by playing with the language of disaster. So keep in mind, listens actively. It's a great way to add power to our questions, to make them powerful questions, and to make the bland version of transformative questions to really come to life. Okay, let's keep going. Comparison. ACC. The coach listens to what the client communicates in relation to the client's agenda, responds to what the client offers to ensure clarity of understanding, and integrates what the client has communicated to support the client in achieving their agenda. You can hear the big focus on the situation, the agenda. The coach's behaviors in this competency may include listening to what the client has communicated verbally, as well as, in the may, as well as to what the client may communicate in other ways, such as tone of voice, energy, or emotional shifts or body language. Now, if we switch this to MCC, it's this. It's always like every line needs to do this. At the or at the ACC level, at least a little bit, and which is also true, I think, at that lower piece of part of the range. If we are doing more transactional coaching, as a person's getting used to the coaching experience, we might be a bit more hands-on. And in that kind of coaching, we still want to bring in meaningful client language. We still want to do that. And even maybe highlighting tone of voice, energy, body language, that kind of thing. But we need to make sure it sounds relevant to the client's agenda in those cases, because if the client senses that we're just deep diving into their expression of what's going on around their language, and they don't really see the point of it, they don't know what this coaching is all about, they might lose the sense of trust and safety because we are almost demanding to do transformative active listening. So keep in mind, we're looking at the ACC version. I think this is a good one to look at when it comes to working with brand new lower readiness clients, and a sponsored engagement especially, where they are a bit hesitant. They are afraid that the coach is going to go, some might be afraid that the coach is going to be psychoanalytical and this is going to be very therapy-like, and I don't like that kind of stuff. If they have that type of resistance, doing deep dives into this as an MCC coach, I'm not going to do that kind of MCC level work with active listening quite so fast. I'm going to help them ramp up to it over time if I get the sense that they're lacking a sense of safety. ACC criteria. Coach uses summarizing, paraphrasing to make sure they understood the client correctly. Now, this is where you see at the ACC level, a coach might use summarizing to ensure understanding. But that, and if we translate that in terms of that idea of range, this can be useful to do for someone who has the expectation that maybe this coach is an expert, maybe this coach is going to tell me what to do. To help them have this sense of safety from time to time, we might say, just to make sure I understand you right, here's what I'm hearing from you. Is that correct? That's not what we want to do. That's not like the ideal form of active listening, because it's very like transactional even in that case. But it might be a nice way to help a person get the sense that the coach is really listening to me. And it can be like a little key that unlocks the door to a deeper expression of that listening. Maybe a paraphrase or an observation about body language with the open interpretation handback of, I'm noticing as you're talking about, the topic, your eyes kind of lit up there. And I know it's a bit of a coachy question, but like, what's behind the eyes lighting up? If I've helped demonstrate some active listening in small, safe ways with maybe a basic summary like this, it might unlock a bit more openness to the deeper versions of active listening. Makes observations that support the client in creating new associations. Similar to what we're talking about there, but oftentimes an ACC observation is going to be a bit more interpretive, a little bit more focused on the coach than the client. So as a coach grows and as you're working with higher readiness client, we usually look at, more fact-based observations about body language and energy shifting, whereas a bit more of a transactional approach might see the coach offering their own interpretation and then letting the client respond to that interpretation with interpretive observations. Again, both are not, like, neither is right or wrong, and you just know that the more you use interpretive observations, what you believe you're seeing on the client side, the more the client might rely on you to offer the interpretations. Whereas the more you're doing fact-based observations of just, I'm noticing this behavior, this pattern, this tone shift, what might be behind that, that's putting more pressure on the client. It's a deeper, more transformative level of work on their side. And so it's oftentimes a little bit less comfortable for them because it's tougher work when they're more on the stage like that. The coach co-creates a shared vision with the client. We give space to them with our listening. Okay. Disqualifiers. The coach does not demonstrate listening that is focused on and responding to what the client communicates. We're just on autopilot the entire time. The coach responses are not related to what the client is trying to achieve. So our questions are like sometimes in an assessment or in a recording, you hear the coach maybe go through the motions of setting the agenda, but then somewhere in the middle of the agenda, the coach has suddenly like got on the scent of something. They are fixated on an interpretation they're developing, and you notice that their questions are like they're not exactly related, but they're related to something very clearly set in the coach's mind, but it's not clear to the client. And so the client's responses go from open responses to, um, is that, did I get that one right? Or is that what you were thinking? And so you see this growing reliance on like, am I as client fitting what the coach's perspective is when the coach goes down this rabbit hole? So we want to make sure we are being responsive, maintaining our presence in our listening as well. The coach appears to be listening for the place where the coach can demonstrate their knowledge about the topic or tell the client what to do about the topic. And yeah, you hear it from time to time. And even when you are like, even a credentialed coach can find themselves in this bucket from time to time if they lose their presence. So if we are facing a high pressure coaching situation, you might find that you begin to focus less on the client's language. Like that column in my own assessment, like that score goes down, and the score, like the amount of reliance on the coach's perspective, knowledge, expertise, and interpretation goes up. So it kind of shifts like that when the presence goes down. And so a good way to know that you might be off balance as a coach is to recognize, oh, I'm not really using their words. And that is totally the way I express this. Like, that's something I always say. I need to return back to coaching. And so check in, breathe, and focus back on the client's original language. If these things are in place, they can be disqualifiers even at the ACC level. Let's look at PCC. 6.1, the coach's questions and observations are customized by using what the coach has learned about the client, who they are, or their situation. So being responsive by customizing our questions so that we're not just asking, what are your values about the thing, but bringing in their words that help them explore that as a topic, as an example. 6.2, the coach inquires about or explores the words the client uses. This is a given, but I do this exercise oftentimes where we kind of score client language on a 1 to 5 scale. And so an ACC coach might be playing at the 2 or 3 level, but a PCC coach needs to consistently play at the 3 to 4 quality level. What that means is, and you can see other content on the site that helps explain it, but what that means is that the coach is hearing the bigger words, like the more meaningful pieces of language, the way the client was expressing things before and the way they're expressing the same theme now. Between all the different iterations of what the client has expressed, the coach is picking up the more meaningful versions of it. So instead of meeting, it's more of disaster, going back to that earlier illustration. The coach inquires about or explores the client's emotions without just saying, how does that make you feel? Sometimes I get onto coaches with feedback, the feedback I provide in mentor coaching, because there's a pattern of feel. There's a lot of different ways to explore emotions. What emotion might be behind that? What are you experiencing right now as you say that out loud? And what feelings come up for you when you walk in the room with that person, so and so. So we want to explore emotions, but we don't want to get repetitive in the way we do it. 6.4, the coach explores the client's energy shifts, nonverbal cues, or other behaviors. And this is where the PCC coach will offer a lot more of a mix of interpretive observations and fact-based observation. The fact-based observations are often going to just highlight what the energy shift was, the nonverbal cue, what it was, and helps the client reflect on what the meaning of that might be. 6.5, the coach inquires about or explores how the client currently perceives themselves or the world. So we recognize that a client is talking about their mindset And so our questions reflect mindset orientation instead of just problem solving in situation. That's what this would be highlighting. The coach allows the client to complete speaking without interrupting. So this goes back to the idea of providing space, unless there's a stated coaching purpose to do so. Interrupting is a valuable and critical, I would say, coaching skill, but it needs to be done very carefully. So unless there's a stated coaching purpose to do so, the coach should allow the client to complete speaking. And if you do need to interrupt, it should be, hey, client name, here's why I'm interrupting, here's my question. Very succinct and to the point and for the client's benefit. The coach succinctly reflects or summarizes what the client communicated to ensure the client's clarity and understanding. This is, I think, the better version of this language that we saw earlier. Why is the summary being done? It's not just for the coach's understanding, but rather, really, this is an evolved version, a stronger version, where we are reflecting or summarizing so that the client's clarity is set, that they understand their words, the differences in what they're saying, the meaning behind what they're sharing. Okay, so you see that shift. MCC. The coach listens as a learner and demonstrates an ability to listen at the logical and emotional level at the same time. You often hear this called level 3 listening. Level 2 listening is kind of listening to what the client is saying. Level 1 listening being listening to our own inner chatter. So level 3 listening at multiple levels at the same time. Responses from the coach evidence learning about the client at multiple levels. The coach's response is evidence that the coach is hearing the client's intuitive abilities, the client's energy, when the client speaks of important things, when new growth is occurring. These are the aha moments, the shifts, how that growth is related to the client's agenda, objectives, and when the client is finding, creating, and using a more powerful sense of self. So evolved, stronger version of the client language. The coach is able to hear the client's current thinking and growth and relate it to the future the client is trying to achieve. Listening holistically. An MCC level coach hears the totality of the client's greatness and gifts, very aspirational, as well as limiting beliefs and patterns. Not for the sake of correcting, but for the sake of helping the client reflect on those differences. The coach's listening is cumulative from session to session and throughout each individual session. And by the way, for my MCC candidates out there, don't ever say, like, I know the person listening to this recording might not know this, but 3 sessions ago, you were talking about how you're almost like in this waltz with this team member, and so I guess how's that idea of the waltz related to this vendor relationship you're trying to develop? Don't ever talk to the assessor. Like, if I were to hear as an outsider the coach ask, how is that idea of dancing with your peer in a waltz related to the vendor? And I can listen, I can look in the transcript. Oh, there's no waltz in here. I guess the coach made that one up. No, it's obvious. It's obvious it's coming from outside the session. And especially it's obvious when the client says, yeah. Well, I guess it's not going to be a waltz. It's going to be a unknown thing to Brian, because I do not know any other dances. I can't even waltz. But like if the client plays with it and picks a different, like, is it tango? I don't know. What's tango? Yeah, it's going to be more like a tango with them. Then we know as an outsider that the coach is listening cumulatively to the client. MCC evaluation criteria. The coach responds to the client with an invitation to a deeper exploration of the client thinking and behaviors. The coach's response to the client demonstrates an understanding of the client's emotions, energy, or learning and growth in alignment with the client's agenda. And so what this is really saying is we are using the client's deeper expression and behaviors in what they've said across a session with the behaviors and their language, the 4 out of 5s and the 5 out of 5s level of client language. And we are helping the client reflect on that language in relation to the whole picture. We're not just exploring the most interesting language of the waltz for fun. but we're helping them think about how the waltz is related to the disaster at the beginning of the session and so on, how they might bring the waltz into the disaster, whatever it might be. The coach reflects what the client communicates in relation to the context of the whole person. Very similar. We're just keeping things very broad in our listening, not just listening for the last sentence, the last paragraph, just the session. We're listening holistically to what we know of the client. Disqualification criteria, there's actually quite a bit here. The coach does not demonstrate listening that is based on the whole client and an ability to hear the client's thinking, learning, and feeling at multiple levels. The listening is filtered only through the coach's method of thinking, learning, and creating, does not actively hear and use as a significant coaching tool the client's methods of thinking, learning, and creating. A good example of this is challenge. I always like to do this one. Opportunity. And then we'll do an X here. What do you do? Yeah, there we go. So sometimes I'm almost corrected. When I used to do assessments, I did them for BetterUp, onboarding assessments for coaches. Sometimes I'd have a coach say something like, I express myself like, it's going to be a real big challenge for me to be empathetic in the way that this team is empathetic, because I usually demonstrate my empathy through getting work done together. But they really talk about life outside of work a lot, and it's going to be kind of challenging for me to step into that space. And sometimes a coach would say, what if instead of seeing it as a challenge, you see it as an opportunity? And I always, and this is only personal, it never really factored into the assessment because that's not what that was about. But to me, just as a client, it would always get me because I love a challenge. When I say challenge, it means something worth doing. And it means an opportunity that is going to be like this mountain to climb that I can kind of get excited about if it's a challenge that's meaningful. So when I was there it is. When I'm told, what if I see it as an opportunity? I don't feel heard. To this client, challenge, the coach listening to me might see that a challenge isn't the same as opportunity. For me, challenge is equal to opportunity. And so if we're just listening to the client, and in this case, if I'm listening to Brian, and Brian says, it's just going to be a really significant challenge, then for me to say, so what would make that challenge worthwhile? Even if internally I might say, I don't like that word challenge. I like to make it, I like to say opportunity instead. I'll just say a challenge. That's the word they said. And I'm going to use that, integrate that into my questions, even if that's not how I would normally express things. So if you hear in an assessment, the coach corrects the client language, moves it to a different space that feels a bit more kind of like the coach's way of thinking, then that's a significant MCC disqualification. It is just something that can get in the way of other levels. And it can even kind of be beneficial to be able to say, as you say challenge, to me, the word opportunity comes up. What are your thoughts? Like that's maybe we call that PCC level. But an MCC should be willing to play with whatever the language is, as long as it's appropriate. We play with the language and help the client unpack it instead of correct it or tweak it. If we tweak the language, it should be done in partnership at the MCC level. Nuances of the client's language are not reflected, disqualifiers, not reflected in the coach's response, or if the coach does not respond to what the client communicates, the coach's response is not related to what the client is trying to achieve, or the coach's listening is primarily focused on the client's problems or weaknesses. So as a coach, we need to be responsive and relate it to the agenda. That's the main thing. And we also need to make sure that we're not just listening for the gaps that we can fill with our own wisdom. Finally, the coach appears to be listening for the place where the coach can jump in and be the teacher, like we saw before. So we want to avoid that. Listens actively. It's a big one, another important one. I hope this was helpful. There's a lot of extra content. Like I said, I like to do that presentation on grading client language and considering how we could grade our own questions that are responsive to the client language that happens throughout a coaching session. Love this topic. It's one of my favorites. So when you look at the journey, beginning your coach training all the way down the road to earning an MCC, if you ever want to pursue that, regardless of that kind of credential journey, you should also see yourself on a journey of having MCC capacity for your listening, because any client can benefit from a little bit of MCC level listening sprinkled into even a transactional session, because that can really establish trust and safety, and the sense of, wow, this is a different kind of experience. This person really hears me, especially if you are able to relate that listening to the agenda. So want to most encourage, I think, around active listening, want to most encourage coaches to consider this as the ideal to pursue. Even if you never pursue MCC as a credential, pursue MCC listening. It is worthwhile. It's why I train coaches with these concepts of MCC listening at the very beginning of coach training, because it's worth considering. Hope this is helpful. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coaching.